Recording. Oh, started it. Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I know we make this available for all members of the Society for Diversity. But thank you all so much for having me today. I am really excited. I advanced. Let me go back one slide. But just to tell you a little bit about myself. So I am a full-time DEI consultant, and I own my own consulting firm called Inclusive Excellence Consulting. And I have been a member of the Society for Diversity, I want to say for at least 3 years. So I am a certified diversity executive. I have a really great relationship with the folks at the Society for Diversity. So whenever there's an opportunity for me to present or to talk about something I'm particularly passionate about, I'm always like, oh, Amber, sign me up. So today what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the power of inclusive storytelling. And I'll tell you all, this is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart because prior to working in DEI, I actually used to work in international education. So I worked at a university. I used to work with like our international scholars and our international student population. And during that time, I started doing a lot of work on the importance of intercultural communication and just different ways we can communicate and tell our stories, right? And I also do some fundraising as a volunteer. So I help different nonprofits. And one thing that I had to learn too, like, oh, if you want to help raise money, you have to tell stories about the organization, right? You have to think about the population you're serving. Are you telling stories in a way that is inclusive and promoting, all of the different people you serve? So for me, like I said, this is just a topic that is really special to me because I think when we tell stories, we can really affect change, and we have to be inclusive and equitable in how we tell those stories. All right. So inclusive storytelling and DEI go hand in hand. And the reason for that is because both inclusive storytelling and diversity, equity, and inclusion both strive to create a more inclusive and equitable society. A lot of times when we talk about DEI, we don't always think about storytelling as a part of that. But as professionals, and no matter what space you work in, whether it's volunteerism or you're working in the workforce or just even in your everyday life, it's important to think about who are we amplifying? How are we amplifying those voices? And are we actually creating spaces where different voices are actually being amplified? So I got a little activity, and of course, I just want you to think about this, but I want you to think of your favorite book, autobiography, documentary, photograph, poem, or piece of art created by someone with a historically minoritized or marginalized identity. So I want everybody to take just maybe like 15 seconds. Think of something that you absolutely love, that every time you read it or you see it, you're like, yes, this is one of my favorites, and it has had a direct impact on me. And while you're thinking, I would like to share a few of mine. So, I have some different things here. And growing up, these were some of the artists, and not just growing up, but recent, like, for example, Amanda Gorman, she's a poet, and just her work is so profound. But I think about some of the different artists and some of the different books I read growing up as a child and the direct impact they had on me and how I learned to think critically because of it. So I remember the first time my dad introduced me to Frida Kahlo, she's on the right side, and her art. And I remember reading the autobiography of Anne Frank and just learning about the Holocaust and all that the Jewish community had to endure during that time. One of my favorite books, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I think about the impact that book had on me and just learning about some of the things she had to endure during her adolescence and childhood and early adulthood. And then in the corner on the lower left-hand side, this is one of my favorite photographs of all time. And this is by Gordon Parks, and the legendary photographer. And then, of course, we have the wonderful poet, Amanda Gorman. But I think about these books and these autobiographies and these photographs and this art and the poetry and all of these different things and how they have directly impacted me. And they've impacted me not just because they're, great quality, the work is exceptional, but because they told diverse stories, right? They looked at folks with a diverse lens, and they were really intentional in making sure that they were amplifying these stories. So now you thought of your favorite book or your favorite autobiography, documentary, photograph, poem. I want you to try to imagine a life where you were never exposed to these things. It's hard to imagine, right? It's hard to imagine because we have been exposed to it and we know what we've learned from it and how much it has impacted us. But we live in a time, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, where, there are some who view certain stories, who view certain books as stories that are not worth being told. And then we have others who are like, no, these stories absolutely need to be told. And so it's something that we have to consider. Centering diverse voices and experiences. And I love this quote here. It says that stories can promote inclusion by valuing and unearthing real, honest, and personal experience beyond your own. What I love about this quote is that it reminds us that in order to really learn about others, to really understand their experiences, that it's important that we decenter ourselves. I have a quick story on this one. So a lot of times as DEI practitioners, we often have to hear different people share their stories, right? We have to hear them share their experiences and maybe some things they've encountered. And one of the things I used to do early in my career is when somebody was sharing something, I'd be like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. Girl, I've been through that too. Yep, I experienced that same. Oh yes, sexism, been there, done that. And I had to stop myself at one point because I realized I was taken away from that other person's experience. What she was doing was sharing her story with me, but I wasn't fully listening because I was also centering myself while she was sharing her story. And so it was a valuable lesson for me because I didn't really realize that I did it. Like I used to do that because what I was trying to do was I was trying to be relatable. I was trying to create a space where people felt safe to open up. So I try to, say like, oh yeah, I can totally relate to that. But when we do that, sometimes we take away from that other person sharing their story. And so that's why it's really important for us to step back as we listen to others and say, okay, this isn't about me right now. Give that person your full attention so that they can share their story in a real, honest, and personal way. So let's talk about some of the benefits of inclusive storytelling. And I want to say this list is not all inclusive. Like I could go on and on because there's so many benefits to it, but I did want to highlight at least some. One of the benefits is representation and visibility, right? And we hear this all the time. Representation matters. We've seen hashtags, we've seen shirts, we've seen, different campaigns going on around the importance of representation because they're right. Inclusive storytelling ensures that people from diverse backgrounds, identities, and experiences are represented in narratives. And it's so important. One of the things that I had a chance to do was meet with a marketing and communications team. And they were at a predominantly or a historically, I guess you'd say predominantly white institution. And one of the things they were very cognizant of is that they wanted to make sure that they were telling stories in a way that was inclusive of all groups, including maybe their African-American students, their Latinx, Hispanic students, and students of various backgrounds. And so one of the things we talked about was making sure that those stories were visible. Are we creating spaces where people can be visible, right? And where those narratives are represented. And so representation is essential. One of the things about inclusive storytelling too is that it creates empathy. Why is this important? So inclusive storytelling fosters empathy and understanding by allowing audiences to connect with characters and experiences that may be different from their own. Additionally, it helps break down stereotypes and prejudices by humanizing diverse individuals and showcasing their unique perspectives. I remember the first time I read the autobiography of Anne Frank. And by the end of it, I was in tears. And then I also think of times where I went to the Holocaust Memorial and Museum. And although I don't identify as Jewish, I remember the empathy and compassion that I felt during that time because I was able to connect with someone else's story. And the reason why this is so important for others to experience the empathy and compassion is because it humanizes other groups, right? You know, we live in a time, especially with media and social media, and we see certain images, it's really easy to become desensitized to certain things and say, oh, another shooting. Oh no, another Black man was killed by the police. Oh no, this happened to this group. And so when we look at it with an empathic lens and we look at it with compassion, we're more likely to humanize that person and their experience. And so that's why it's so important for us to be inclusive in our storytelling and make sure that we're encouraging others to view stories and listen to stories with empathy. One of the things about inclusive storytelling is that it has the power to challenge and dismantle oppressive power structures. How? By giving voice to marginalized communities, inclusive narratives can address social, political, and cultural inequities. A lot of times, and this is quite common, especially when you read different sources and you look in the media, a lot of times we tend to centralize the majority narrative, right? And so something that might be, trying to think of the best way to say it. So something that might be prevalent within a majority culture, that becomes normalized. But when you start amplifying marginalized communities and you're inclusive in your narratives and addressing different social, political, and cultural inequalities, then you start to challenge power structures, right? Whether that's within a workforce, whether that's within society, within the media, it's really important for us to think about oppressive power structures and challenge those structures by sharing others' narratives. One of the more obvious things about inclusive storytelling is that it broadens our perspectives, right? And if we're not exposed to these different stories, then we're never able to see things through someone else's lens, right? And so I like this here. Inclusive storytelling encourages us to see the world through different lenses and challenges our preconceived notions. This often leads to personal growth, critical thinking, and a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of the human experience. If we don't allow ourselves to learn things that are different, or learn about people who are different, or experiences that may be different from our own, a lot of times what ends up happening is that we operate with a lot of preconceived notions, and we may even build stereotypes around a certain group or individual if we don't challenge ourselves. We have to constantly challenge our preconceived notions and some of the perspectives we have in order to broaden our perspectives. Now, I'm going to go into this. People ask me all the time as a DEI consultant, what's the business case for this, right? And, I'm trying to put on my voice, but I get that quite a bit. People want to know, like, well, why is this relevant to my business? How can this affect our company? And the reality is that when you serve a diverse market, you have to think about your clients. You have to think about your customers. You have to think about the populations you serve. And so we know that inclusive storytelling is not just an ethical imperative, but it also makes good business sense. Audiences today are increasingly diverse and seek stories that reflect their realities. And by catering to this demand, storytellers can tap into new markets, reach wider audiences, and create successful and financially viable content. I have, I love pop culture. I'm a big Beyonce fan. I think a lot of people know that. I probably referenced Beyonce in my last presentation. But when she decided on what brand she wanted to work with in terms of Adidas and then another brand, one of the things that stood out for her was, well, I'm looking at the leadership and I'm looking at the people in this room right now, and they don't necessarily reflect my customer base. But over here at Adidas, I'm looking at the diverse leaders that are in the room and the diverse decision makers, and they reflect the population that I'm selling my products to, right? And so that's something you have to take into consideration, is that when you think about the market and you think about your customers and your clients and who you serve, it's really important to make sure that you are including inclusive stories and that you're being very intentional with amplifying others. One of my favorite commercials right now, I don't know if you all have had the opportunity to see the commercial with Apple, where it's very disability, like they focus on disability inclusion, and they have, people of just all backgrounds and all, it's just a really beautiful commercial. And what I love about it is that we don't see enough of it, and I feel like they hit they got it right. And it's like, when you share those kind of stories, it's like, oh, I feel seen, especially as a woman who's a part of the hard of hearing community. For me, that felt really special. And people do want to see themselves represented in the market and within companies. And then the thing about inclusive storytelling is that it has the potential to create a positive social impact by promoting social justice, equality, and inclusivity, right? And we know this. So, I talked about some of my favorite books and some of my favorite artists. And, I know we all have different books and artists that we love. And when you think about the impact that those stories have had on society, is undeniable. And we know that it can inspire individuals and communities to take action, challenge discriminatory practices, and work towards a more equitable society. So that's why inclusive storytelling is so important, because when we do this, we are amplifying people of all backgrounds, all ethnicities, all races, you name it. And no matter what identities they may hold, it's important that we have that representation. So there is no way I can talk about storytelling and talk about stories without talking about some of the realities that we face as a society, right? I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk specifically about bans and book bans in particular, because we know that this is a reality. I had a chance to meet with a group of higher education leaders. And one of the topics that came up during our discussion, as we talked about the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education, is that right now, what we're going to see is a lot of students come from the K-12 system to some of these colleges and universities without ever being exposed to some of the books that maybe we were exposed to. So for example, I'll go back. Let me go back a few slides. So there are students, right, in the K-12 system right now who may not be exposed to Maya Angelou or Anne Frank or some of the other authors that maybe we had a chance to learn about. And that's a reality that they had to think through as professionals, right? And so here's what we know. We know that book bans in the US refer to instances when certain books and materials are restricted or prohibited from being available in schools, libraries, and communities. These bans typically occur due to concerns over content that some individuals or groups find objectionable or inappropriate. And one thing I really want to stress is that it varies from state to state. So if you look at that last bullet point, it says it's worth noting that the prevalence and extent of book bans vary across different states, communities, and institutions in the US. So what are the feelings on it, right? Because there's a lot of controversy around this. And why do people have certain feelings about certain books? So I'm going to break this down. So advocates for book bans argue that they are necessary to protect certain values or beliefs, particularly when it comes to protecting children from explicit or sensitive content. So the reason why we have seen a recent spike in certain books being banned in different communities is because there are some who feel that the content is too explicit or sensitive, and it's specifically for children who are 18 and younger. But then you have on the other end of that spectrum is that critics of book bans argue that they undermine freedom of speech, expression, and access to information. They believe that individuals should have the right to access a wide range of viewpoints and perspectives, even if those viewpoints are challenging or uncomfortable. So what we're finding is that we're in an interesting place right now. And one thing I want to note too, book bans are not new. So Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Birds Sing, that book was banned in the 80s at one point in some states and communities. But the reason I mentioned this is because we've seen a drastic increase, right? And so it's something that we have to take into consideration as we talk about, okay, if these narratives aren't being shared, then how do we inform people of some of these diverse stories and some of these, different stories that may be deemed as controversial, right? So let's just a quick breakdown by state, because like I said, it's going to vary state to state. But as you can see, there are some states where, there's over 1,000 books banned. And then it could be anywhere from 0 bans at all. So for example, we know California, it looks like Arizona, there aren't any banned books. Then you can go as far as Texas and some of the other states where you see that there are several books banned, right? And one of the things that you notice is that it's certain content that's banned. And so I'll leave this up for a second. But usually stories that are LGBTQ plus themes, protagonists or prominent secondary characters of color, books that may have some sexual content, titles and issues with race and racism. And we know, as especially for those of us who work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion sector, it's really hard to say, hey, this is a great resource if you want to learn about anti-racism when the book on anti-racism are banned because of the title, right? And so this is something that we have to take into consideration. And then books on rights and activism, certain biographies, and then stories on religious minorities. And so I just kind of have a further breakdown of exactly how many books are banned based on the categories. And I'll be sure to make sure everybody has access to the slides. So as we think about this, right, because it's a very complex issue of thinking, okay, we know that we live during a time where there is a lot of advocacy in terms of inclusive storytelling, but there's also some resistance as well. So we want to operate in a space where we are advocating for inclusive storytelling in our everyday lives, right? So what does that need to look like? One of the things I always tell people is to think about all of the different ways you communicate and think about how you can have a DEI lens when communicating. And of course, I have this great illustration of diversity, equity, inclusion. And then of course it includes belonging on it. But there's a lot of different ways we communicate and a lot of different ways that we can share stories, whether it's through websites, press releases, emails, internal communications, promotional materials, videos, newsletters, social media, reports, photographies. I mean, there's so many different ways that we're constantly communicating information. And sometimes we don't always think about it. Like it just comes so second nature that we don't stop and think like, oh, are we communicating this in a way that's inclusive? Are we including others in this and sharing the perspectives and experiences of those with different backgrounds, right? And so that's why I have this here to just think through all of the different ways we're constantly communicating. So I love this because it kind of breaks down how you can make storytelling inclusive and equitable. And so I'll just kind of briefly go through these. And so the first thing is help people speak for themselves by showcasing and allowing them to showcase their authentic diversity. One of the things that we can do sometimes without realizing it is that we sometimes speak up on behalf of others instead of giving them the opportunity to speak for themselves. And the reason that's so important is that, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, is that sometimes we have to decenter ourselves and allow information to come directly from the source. So if you have someone who wants to talk about their experience as an LGBTQ plus employee in the workforce, then create space for that person to share their story, as opposed to us saying like, oh, well, I'm going to share this person's story. It's really important for us to create that space and encourage others and help them share their own stories. The second one is highlight diverse backgrounds and different abilities and viewpoints as positive. We know that there are certain media sources and just certain information out there that is rife with bias and stereotypes. And so in order to dismantle that, it's important for us to highlight the positive. I have a podcast that I do with a fellow co-host. And what we did this week, is that we did a tribute to Black fathers in particular. And the reason for that is that we felt like it was important for us to elevate and talk about all of the wonderful fathers in our community. We were both raised by great fathers. And we also recognize that there are some stereotypes and misconceptions, right, about Black fathers in America. And so what we did is we wanted to shine light on that and specifically highlight positive things that we see and that we've seen in our community when it comes to Black fatherhood. Explore multiple identities, allowing people to take pride in their unique experiences. It is really important as we think about diversity that we think about it with an intersectional lens, right? And I get to this a little bit later, but think about who's included, who's not included, who's in the room right now, who's not in the room, whose story are we telling? Are we missing anyone, right? And it's important for us, like I said, to look at it with an intersectional lens and think about all of the different identities that people hold. Inspire questions and sharing of similar experiences to learn about each other. I am a firm believer that the more curious you are, the more you're going to learn, right? If you ask questions and you truly operate in a way where you are showing curiosity, then you're more likely to grow personally and professionally and grow in all of the different ways. And the same is true for your audience. So if you're creating that space for people to share their experiences and you're asking questions, they're more likely to share more information about their identities or whatever it is that they may be sharing about. Help people make connections within and between cultures. One of the beauties of inclusive storytelling is that as you start learning about other people and other cultures, is that you want to become connected to it. And a lot of us have traveled at some point, whether it's within the US or you traveled abroad, and you know that when you experience a new culture, you're more likely to want to learn more about it and become connected to it. And the same is true with inclusive storytelling. When I hear someone share a story, let's say I'm at a conference, and this is true for many of us, we hear them share a story and we're like, wow, that's really powerful. And so you stay behind at the end of the session and you have a conversation with that person at the end and you're like, this was really great, right? And because you're interested because they shared something that was meaningful and you connected to it. Be open to opportunities for talking about themes of injustice and power. This is very important because, and it goes back to the previous slide where we talked about the impact, the positive social impact that inclusive storytelling can have. And a lot of times, especially in the workforce, I know I work with quite a few organizations, they're worried that if they talk about something like a current policy or something that's happening in the nation, that they're going to cause more, they're going to cause, it's going to create disagreements and arguments, when actually, if conversations are facilitated in a way where, people know, like, okay, we're entering this with an open mind, with respect, and, actually it can create a space where a lot of critical thought and conversations can happen. And so sometimes, although we may feel like we have to avoid controversy or avoid topics that could be deemed as controversial, sometimes it's really important to have those conversations in order to, create more unity within an organization. And people don't always think about it that way, but there have been times where I've had conversations as well with a person and I'm like, I don't agree, but I appreciate you for sharing this. I've gained a lot by learning from your perspective. And then the last one is to challenge stereotypes, generalizations, and prejudice by helping people express emotions and engage in meaningful dialogue. So dialogue is the key here, right? Because it's storytelling. And so we want to do it in a way where we are challenging preconceived notions, generalizations, and stereotypes. And the more we create those spaces for people to engage in inclusive and authentic storytelling, the more likely we are to challenge stereotypes and beliefs that aren't true. Now, really quickly, I'm looking at the time. Oh, I'm doing good. Okay. Because I get passionate. I love this topic. So I had to make sure I'm staying within that hour frame. But I have had the opportunity to talk about allyship in the past. I facilitated a webinar with the Society for Diversity. And you all know I love to reference Better Allies by Karen Caitlin. And there's 3 things I want to highlight in particular. So you have 7 types of allyship you can see here. And if you look, you see some arrows pointed at the words. And I want to talk about how you can also promote inclusive storytelling through allyship. So champion. What is a champion? Who is a champion? A champion sends out a powerful message by voluntarily deferring to colleagues from underrepresented groups in meetings, events, and conferences. You can be a champion by suggesting colleagues as panelists or recommending them to speak for you if they're an equally good fit. A lot of times, especially in the workforce, and we see this happen quite a bit, is that, and I'll use a personal example for this one, but in my previous role, I was the only African-American woman on the leadership team. And a lot of times there would be moments where I was like, well, I don't want to speak up. Maybe I should just, because I don't want to be perceived as angry or, this particular topic, I have to be very mindful of everything, right? But I had a colleague who was really good about saying, you know what, MJ, I think would be perfect at leading this meeting, or MJ would be perfect at just being the webinar host for that, or, whatever. But he was really good about championing me. And so that made me feel a sense of belonging, just knowing that I had colleagues supporting me. And so that's why it's important to take on the champion role too, and encourage others to tell their stories. Scholar. So when an ally takes on the role of scholar, that ally seeks to learn as much as possible about the challenges and prejudices faced by colleagues. It's important to note that scholars never insert their own opinions, experiences, or ideas, but instead simply listen and learn. Part of the reason it is so important for us to have these conversations and to learn about others' experiences, whether it's through literature, like I said, autobiographies, poems, and different forms of art, is that, we become more informed. And I'll admit, when it comes to the book bans, I find it a little concerning, because what I never want to see is our society get to the point where we are completely silencing minoritized and marginalized populations, right? And so personally, I think it's really important to read and to learn about the experiences of others. I talked about Anne Frank. I never knew anything about the Holocaust until I read Anne Frank's autobiography. Like, I had heard of it, but I didn't know the impact of it. And I didn't know anyone personally who may have been a survivor or who might have been a descendant of a Holocaust survivor, right? And so it was through that book and me reading her story that I was able to learn, right? And it's equally important for all of us to learn through literature and through other scholarly sources. And it's also important for us to encourage others to do the same. And then probably the most obvious one of the 7 is amplifier. So when an ally takes on the role of the amplifier, they focus on ensuring that a wide range of voices are heard. This type of allyship can take many forms, but is focused on representation within communication, right? And so amplifier is not necessarily speaking for someone else, but we're making sure that they have a space to speak, if that makes sense. So you have the microphone, you are passing the mic as an amplifier, like, hey, your story needs to be told. I'm handing you the microphone. So questions to consider, right? As you think about the power of inclusive storytelling, and you think about how you want to make sure that you're engaged in inclusive storytelling, and that your organization is engaged in inclusive storytelling. These are some things that I want you to ask yourself, right? Who is present? Who's absent? And why are they absent? I want you to ask yourself, are some perspectives not heard from while others are provided frequently? I want you to ask yourselves, are there barriers to participation? So oftentimes, and let's stick to that one just for a second. A lot of times we'll say, well, we want to be more inclusive in our storytelling. We want to tell the stories of others. We want to share more in our newsletter and on the website, but we haven't had a lot of people participate. I sent out this survey, nobody responded. We have to ask ourselves, are there certain barriers to participation? Is the survey the best way to get that information from a certain group or from a certain person? Is there a better way to reach that person to make sure that their voice is heard and that their story is told? Are some voices and perspectives disproportionately represented among members of a particular identity group? And we see this, quite a bit with in certain publications and in certain media outlet sources, where it's like you may hear from certain groups more than others, right? And so it's important for us to think about that. And then that last question is, are specific communication styles assumed to be ideal? And the reason that particular question is important is that people communicate and share their stories and beliefs in a lot of different ways. And for example, I mentioned the survey. If we say that, well, the only way for you to share your story is if you write it out for me. Is that the only way they can share their story? Does it have to be in a written format? Personally, I'm dyslexic, just so y'all know. So I'm a part of the hard of hearing community and dyslexic. So I do a lot of work around neurodiversity and disability inclusion. And for me, when somebody says, hey, you have the option for me to interview you and we can record the interview or you can write it up, I'm like, hey, interview me and let's record it. Because me typing, I'm just, I'm self-conscious of, oh, it could be a typo in here, and so that's something you want to think about, is that, are you assuming that certain communication styles are ideal? And are you creating an opportunity for people to share their stories in different ways, in different formats? So let's see, how we're doing. Good. Okay, about 5 more minutes and then we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. But I want you all to think about these different ways to center diverse stories and experiences, right? So this first one, is to seek out and include voices from marginalized communities. Consult with individuals who have those lived experiences. The first two are particularly important because no one can tell their story like the person who's telling their story, right? I just think about how sometimes we'll go into a situation assuming that we know certain things about people. And then once we sit down and talk with those individuals, it's like, oh, I never knew that. And so that's why it's so important to allow people to share their stories, to allow people to share their experiences, get it directly from the source. Another thing to consider when you are centering diverse stories and experiences is that you want to avoid stereotypes or tokenism. Authenticity and respectful portrayal are key. The reason this is so important is that sometimes we'll go in making assumptions, and we all have biases, that's natural, but it's important for us to challenge those biases by going in, listening, being considerate and listening with empathy and truly seeking to understand that person's experience without preconceived notions about that person and what you think that person may say or who you think that person might be, right? It's really important to listen and focus in on what they're saying without stereotypes and tokenism. And then you want to give space for underrepresented groups to be the protagonists and tell their own stories, showcasing the complexity and uniqueness of their perspectives. Can't emphasize that one enough. I have a few more here. I know it's a lot, but this is a really important topic. So another way to center diverse stories and experiences is to recognize the intersectionality of identities and experiences, right? And so we talked about that a little bit, is that a lot of times people bring different identities with them no matter where they go. And so my experience as a Black neurodivergent woman who is hard of hearing may be a lot different than someone else's lived experience, right? And so we have to understand intersectionality and how all those intersecting identities help, how they create a person's experience, how they shape their reality, and how it can potentially shape their stories. Actively seek out and collaborate with diverse creators, writers, consultants, and artists. This is very important as well. I remember last year, it was either last year or the year before, that Google, there was a young man who created like this little art thing for Google, in honor of Juneteenth, because I guess they didn't have like a piece of art up. You know how they changed their image on their website in honor of like a certain month or just in honor of a certain heritage. And what he ended up doing was getting a job with Google. He said, hey, Google, I noticed you didn't put anything up for Juneteenth. Here you go. And it went viral. And just like that, it took off, right? And so you have this young African-American creator who showed them, hey, this is something you can do, in honor of Juneteenth from here on out. And it created an opportunity for him. And it also created an opportunity for the organization as well. Educate yourself and your team about different cultures, histories, and perspectives. Conduct thorough research and engage in respective dialogue with individuals from diverse communities. That goes back to the scholar piece. That goes back to, just educating ourselves and making sure that we have an understanding of different cultures and perspectives, right? When we engage with individuals, it's really important for us to have that knowledge. Use your platform and influence to amplify diverse voices. And I'm going to go back a few slides, but when you think about those platforms, that can look a lot of different ways. So it can be on websites. You can amplify through press releases, internal communications, promotional materials, videos, newsletters, on your social media outlets. You can amplify diverse voices through photography and different reports. There's so many different ways you can do it. And so that's why it's important for us to think about what platforms can we use to amplify diverse voices and stories. And then for the last one, encourage open discussions, engage with different perspectives, and be willing to make adjustments based on constructive criticism. Part of the reason a lot of folks avoid talking about topics that could be deemed as, oh, will this cause conflict, or, will this cause some kind of controversy, is because they're afraid of criticism as well. But when you're doing this kind of work, and it goes back to decentering yourself, right? There's always going to be someone who may say, you know what? Hey, I don't like how you did this. I don't like how you told this story. I feel like you left this person out, or you left this group out, right? And you just have to be willing to take on constructive criticism in order to be better, and in order to make sure you are truly being inclusive and equitable in how you share the perspectives and stories of others, right? And so don't be afraid of criticism, embrace it and say like, all right, well, we got to do better. So next time we'll make sure that we are more inclusive in our approach. And so as we wrap up, because I do want to leave enough time for us to engage in some dialogue, but I want us to remember that centering diverse stories and experiences is an ongoing commitment. Just like we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion work is a journey, not a destination. The same holds true for, our amplifying diverse stories and experiences, right? It's an ongoing commitment. It's not just a one and done, like, okay, we're going to put this picture on a website, boom, all right, we just show we're diverse. It's so much more than that. And that's something that we have to be mindful of. And by embracing diversity and actively working to uplift marginalized voices, you can contribute to a more inclusive and representative storytelling landscape. And so that is my closing paragraph. And I know this was a lot of information, and I will make sure that everyone has access to the slides. And I have my contact information here on this last page, and I'll just leave it up for a second. And then what I would like to do is to open it up for us to have some discussion. I do see there are some comments in the chat. I haven't been able to keep up. I have a hard time reading the chat and presenting at the same time. So I'm hoping that maybe we can go ahead and open this up for discussion now. So I will stop sharing.
Of course. So what we can do is I'll ask the questions in the chat first.
Okay.
And so you can answer them. And then if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll promote you to a panelist. So the first question is, what was the name of the ally book that you referred?
Yeah, so that's by Karen Caitlin. The name of the book, and I'll put it in the chat, is called Better Allies. So I'm going to just copy and paste this for you. And it's a really good book. Okay, everyone.
And then the second question is, what are your thoughts on best practices to work with diverse-owned media platforms?
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. And that kind of goes back to the collaboration piece, right? And making sure that you're working with different organizations where you have diverse representation and where they might be able to bring a different perspective to the work that you're doing. So I know a lot of organizations have maybe supplier diversity programs where they're very intentional and, okay, we want to work with diverse owned media organizations and outlets, or we want to work with diverse vendors. And I think it's really good because you want to work with folks who understand the populations that you're working with or the populations that you're trying to reach, right? And so that's why I think that's really important.
Okay. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I can promote you to a panelist. Question, comments, feedback? All right. Well,
thank you so much. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Cindy, as well. All right. Thank you, Finesse. Appreciate you. And like I said, we'll make sure everybody has access to the PowerPoint it's a lot of information, but it's an important topic, especially now more than ever, when it's like you just see this back and forth of, oh, side, don't share that story, don't share this book. And it's like, no, we have to share these stories because they're important. Oh, it looks like Cindy has a question.
Yeah, Dr. McConner, I really enjoyed this. I have a PhD in mythological studies, so story is very near to my heart. And I really love the connection with Dr. Caitlin's book, because I feel like those are really concrete ways that we can do the things that you're asking. Because at the beginning, I was thinking to myself, well, what situation would I be in? What activity could I create or promote in order to amplify these stories or center these stories? And then you just gave a list of things that I can do. So I really appreciate that. And this has just been really wonderful to hear. And I feel like DEI can get very, like you were talking about people wanting the business plan or whatever, and it's like it can get so number oriented, and this feels like it's very humanity oriented. And I just really appreciate that, because I think that's really where we make change.
Yes, I love that. And you know what, I'm glad you said that, because I'm a firm believer that the business case for DEI work and the human case have to go hand in hand. You can't you can't look at it purely from a number standpoint and everything. And storytelling, that's a very human centric thing, right? Like when people are sharing their stories and lived experiences and perspectives, like you have to look at the human side of folks. So yes, absolutely. And thank you for that feedback. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, sure did.
Would anyone else like to come off mute and share?
Thank you all for your feedback. Yeah, and you know, this is, like I said, it's a topic I'm really passionate about. I could go on and on, but I was like, okay, I know I got 1 hour because I had some other examples. But I still might send out like the extended version of the PowerPoint too, if y'all want that. But I shortened it a little bit because I knew. Where are you based out of? So I live in Memphis, Tennessee, but I work with organizations all across the nation. In here. Oh, it looks like a hand is raised. Here's my company website.
Yeah. Pamela, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Yes, I just, want to thank you for, the presentation today. It's just so beautiful. And I think this is just a beautiful topic. And, when you mentioned around the centering and making sure that the diverse voices are being represented, we all fall into that space of not listening when someone's telling their story. And so I appreciate you uplifting that, because in the work that we do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's important for us to hear people's stories, because everyone has a story. And so when we tend to put ourselves in there, and so that just reminded me to just continue to be an active listener and be curious and ask questions after that person has shared their story. So I just appreciate you starting with that, because that really set the foundation on what it's all about when people share their stories and how we get our stories out there. And it's important for us to just make sure that stories are just continue to be told, just as just as our history is important. So I just, appreciate you starting with that, because, so often we could derail that conversation or that storytelling when we include ourselves. And not saying that we can't, but listen first and then be curious and allow that person to share. So I just wanted to just put that out there, because that really set the foundation for me to really take in what you were saying. So I appreciate your presentation today.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm glad you like that. And it's one of those things. Sometimes we don't even always realize we're doing it. And then we have to stop, oh, let me stop talking. Let me let the person talk, but absolutely. Thank you for sharing that feedback.
All right. Any other takers? Let's see. Going once, going twice.
Thank you, Dina.
All right. Well, Dr. MJ, we appreciate you as always. We look forward to continue to work with you in the future. For those who are on the call, Dr. MJ will be back in a couple of weeks for neurodiversity in the workplace. If you haven't registered, go ahead and register now, because registration closes at 12 o'clock. We already have 220 individuals registered to attend that webinar. It's going to be an amazing experience. I'm really looking forward to it. And as always, I will send out a follow-up email from today's webinar. And if you have any questions for Dr. MJ, please direct them to her. I hope you all have a great day. Stay safe and talk to y'all soon.